Chapter 3 of Martin Eden by Jack London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. As Martin Eden went down the steps, his hand dropped into his coat pocket. It came out with a brown rice paper and a pinch of Mexican tobacco, which were deftly rolled together into a cigarette. He drew the first whiff of smoke deep into his lungs and expelled it in a long and lingering exhalation. "By God," he said aloud, in a voice of awe and wonder. "By God," he repeated. And yet again he murmured, "By God." Then his hand went to his collar, which he ripped out of the shirt and stuffed into his pocket. A cold drizzle was falling, but he bared his head to it and unbuttoned his vest, swinging along in splendid unconcern. He was only dimly aware that it was raining. He was in an ecstasy, dreaming dreams and reconstructing the scenes just past. He had met the woman at last, the woman that he had thought little about, not being given to thinking about women, but whom he had expected, in a remote way, he would sometime meet. He had sat next to her at table. He had felt her hand in his. He had looked into her eyes and caught a vision of a beautiful spirit, but no more beautiful than the eyes through which it shone, nor than the flesh that gave it expression and form. He did not think of her flesh as flesh, which was new to him. For of the women he had known, that was the only way he thought. Her flesh was somehow different. He did not conceive of her body as a body, subject to the ills and frailties of bodies. Her body was more than the garb of her spirit. It was an emanation of her spirit, a pure and gracious crystallization of her divine essence. This feeling of the divine startled him. It shocked him from his dreams to sober thought. No word, no clue, no hint of the divine had ever reached him before. He had never believed in the divine. He had always been irreligious, scoffing good-naturedly at the sky pilots and their immortality of the soul. There was no life beyond, he had contended. It was here and now, then darkness everlasting. But what he had seen in her eyes was soul, immortal soul that could never die. No man he had ever known, nor any woman, had given him the message of immortality, but she had. She had whispered it to him the first moment she looked at him. Her face shimmered before his eyes as he walked along, pale and serious, sweet and sensitive, smiling with pity and tenderness as only a spirit could smile, and pure as he had never dreamed purity could be. Her purity smote him like a blow. It startled him. He had known good and bad, but purity, as an attribute of existence, had never entered his mind. And now, in her, he conceived purity to be the superlative of goodness and of cleanness, the sum of which constituted eternal life, and promptly urged his ambition to grasp at eternal life. He was not fit to carry water for her, he knew that. It was a miracle of luck and a fantastic stroke that had enabled him to see her and be with her and talk with her that night. It was accidental. There was no merit in it. He did not deserve such fortune. His mood was essentially religious. He was humble and meek, filled with self-disparagement and abasement. In such frame of mind, sinners come to the penitent form. He was convicted of sin. But as the meek and lowly at the penitent form catch splendid glimpses of their future lordly existence, so did he catch similar glimpses of the state he would gain to by possessing her. But this possession of her was dim and nebulous, and totally different from possession as he had known it. Ambition soared on mad wings, and he saw himself climbing the heights with her, sharing thoughts with her, pleasuring in beautiful and noble things with her. It was a soul possession he dreamed, refined beyond any grossness, a free comradeship of spirit that he could not put into definite thought. He did not think it. For that matter, he did not think at all. Sensation usurped reason, and he was quivering and palpitant with emotions he had never known, drifting deliciously on a sea of sensibility where feeling itself was exalted and spiritualized, and carried beyond the summits of life. He staggered along like a drunken man, murmuring fervently aloud, "By God! By God!" A policeman on a street corner eyed him suspiciously, then noted his sailor roll. "Where did you get it?" the policeman demanded. Martin Eden came back to earth. He was a fluid organism, swiftly adjustable, capable of flowing into and filling all sorts of nooks and crannies. With the policeman's hail, he was immediately his ordinary self, grasping the situation clearly. "It's a beaut, ain't it?" he laughed back. "I didn't know I was talking out loud." "You'll be singing next," was the policeman's diagnosis. "No, I won't. Give me a match and I'll catch the next car home." He lighted his cigarette and said good night and went on. "Now wouldn't that rattle you?" he ejaculated under his breath. "That copper thought I was a drunk." He smiled to himself and meditated. "I guess I was," he added, "but I didn't think a woman's face'd do it." He caught a Telegraph Avenue car that was going to Berkeley. It was crowded with youths and young men who were singing songs and ever and again barking out college yells. He studied them curiously. They were university boys. They went to the same university that she did, were in her class socially, could know her, could see her every day if they wanted to. He wondered that they did not want to, that they had been out having a good time instead of being with her that evening, talking with her, sitting around in a worshipful and adoring circle. His thoughts wandered on. He noticed one with narrow-slitted eyes and a loose-lipped mouth. That fellow was vicious, he decided. On shipboard he would be a sneak, a whiner, a tattler. He, Martin Eden, was a better man than that fellow. The thought cheered him. It seemed to draw him nearer to her. He began comparing himself with the students. He grew conscious of the muscled mechanism of his body, and felt confident that he was physically their master. But their heads were filled with knowledge that enabled them to talk her talk. The thought depressed him. But what was a brain for? He demanded passionately. What they had done, he could do. They had been studying about life from the books, while he had been busy living life. His brain was just as full of knowledge as theirs, though it was a different kind of knowledge. How many of them could tie a lanyard knot, or take a wheel or a lookout? His life spread out before him in a series of pictures of danger and daring, hardship and toil. He remembered his failures and scrapes in the process of learning. He was that much to the good, anyway. Later on, they would have to begin living life and going through the mill as he had gone. Very well. While they were busy with that, he would be learning the other side of life from the books. As the car crossed the zone of scattered dwellings that separated Oakland from Berkeley, he kept a lookout for a familiar two-story building along the front of which ran the proud sign, Higginbotham's Cash Store. Martin Eden got off at this corner. He stared up for a moment at the sign. It carried a message to him beyond its mere wording. A personality of smallness and egotism and petty underhandedness seemed to emanate from the letters themselves. Bernard Higginbotham had married his sister, and he knew him well. He let himself in with a latchkey and climbed the stairs to the second floor. Here lived his brother-in-law. The grocery was below. There was a smell of stale vegetables in the air. As he groped his way across the hall, he stumbled over a toy cart, left there by one of his numerous nephews and nieces, and brought up against a door with a resounding bang. The pincher, was his thought, too miserly to burn 2 cents worth of gas and save his boarders' necks. He fumbled for the knob and entered a lighted room where sat his sister and Bernard Higginbotham. She was patching a pair of his trousers, while his lean body was distributed over 2 chairs, his feet dangling in dilapidated carpet slippers over the edge of the second chair. He glanced across the top of the paper he was reading, showing a pair of dark, insincere, sharp-staring eyes. Martin Eden never looked at him without experiencing a sense of repulsion. What his sister had seen in the man was beyond him. The other affected him as so much vermin, and always aroused in him an impulse to crush him under his foot. "Some day I'll beat the face off of him," was the way he often consoled himself for enduring the man's existence. The eyes, weasel-like and cruel, were looking at him complainingly. "Well," Martin demanded, "out with it." "I had that door painted only last week," Mr. Higginbotham half whined, half bullied. "And you know what union wages are. You should be more careful." Martin had intended to reply, but he was struck by the hopelessness of it. He gazed across the monstrous sordidness of soul to a chromo on the wall. It surprised him. He had always liked it, but it seemed that now he was seeing it for the first time. It was cheap, that was what it was, like everything else in this house. His mind went back to the house he had just left, and he saw, first, the paintings, and next, her, looking at him with melting sweetness as she shook his hand at leaving. He forgot where he was, and Bernard Higginbotham's existence, till that gentleman demanded, "Seen a ghost?" Martin came back and looked at the beady eyes, sneering, truculent, cowardly, and there leaped into his vision, as on a screen, the same eyes when their owner was making a sale in the store below, subservient eyes, smug and oily and flattering. "Yes," Martin answered, "I seen a ghost. Good night. Good night, Gertrude." He started to leave the room, tripping over a loose seam in the slatternly carpet. "Don't bang the door," Mr. Higginbotham cautioned him. He felt the blood crawl in his veins, but controlled himself and closed the door softly behind him. Mr. Higginbotham looked at his wife exultantly. "He's been drinkin'," he proclaimed in a hoarse whisper. "I told you he would." She nodded her head resignedly. "His eyes was pretty shiny," she confessed, "and he didn't have no collar, though he went away with one, but maybe he didn't have more'n a couple of glasses." "He couldn't stand up straight," asserted her husband. "I watched him. He couldn't walk across the floor without stumbling. You heard him yourself almost fall down in the hall." "I think it was over Alice's cart," she said. "He couldn't see in the dark." Mr. Higginbotham's voice and wrath began to rise. All day he effaced himself in the store, reserving for the evening with his family the privilege of being himself. "I tell you, that brother of yours was drunk." His voice was cold, sharp, and final, his lips stamping the enunciation of each word like the die of a machine. His wife sighed and remained silent. She was a large, stout woman, always dressed slatternly, and always tired from the burdens of her flesh, her work, and her husband. "He's got it in him, I tell you, from his father," Mr. Higginbotham went on accusingly. "And he'll croak in the gutter the same way, you know that." She nodded, sighed, and went on stitching. They were agreed that Martin had come home drunk. They did not have it in their souls to know beauty, or they would have known that those shining eyes and that glowing face betokened youth's first vision of love. "Settin' a fine example to the children," Mr. Higginbotham snorted, suddenly, in the silence for which his wife was responsible, and which he resented. Sometimes he almost wished she would oppose him more. "If he does it again, he's got to get out, understand? I won't put up with his shenanigan, debauchin' innocent children with his boozing." Mr. Higginbotham liked the word, which was a new one in his vocabulary, recently gleaned from a newspaper column. "That's what it is, debauchin'. There ain't no other name for it." Still his wife sighed, shook her head sorrowfully, and stitched on. Mr. Higginbotham resumed the newspaper. "Has he paid last week's board?" He shot across the top of the newspaper. She nodded, then added, "He still has some money." "When is he going to sea again?" "When his payday's spent, I guess," she answered. "He was over to San Francisco yesterday looking for a ship, but he's got money yet, and he's particular about the kind of ship he signs for." It's not for a deck swab like him to put on airs, Mr. Higginbotham snorted. Particular. Him. He said something about a schooner that's getting ready to go off to some outlandish place to look for buried treasure, that he'd sail on her if his money held out. If he only wanted to steady down, I'd give him a job driving the wagon, her husband said, but with no trace of benevolence in his voice. Tom's quit. His wife looked alarm and interrogation. Quit tonight. Is going to work for Carruthers. They paid him more than I could afford. I told you you'd lose him, she cried out. He was worth more than you was giving him. Now look here, old woman, Higginbotham bullied. For the 1,000th time I've told you to keep your nose out of the business. I won't tell you again. I don't care, she sniffled. Tom was a good boy. Her husband glared at her. This was unqualified defiance. If that brother of yours was worth his salt, he could take the wagon, he snorted. He pays his board just the same, was the retort. And he's my brother, and so long as he don't owe you money, you've got no right to be jumping on him all the time. I've got some feelings, if I have been married to you for 7 years. Did you tell him you'd charge him for gas if he goes on reading in bed? He demanded. Mrs. Higginbotham made no reply. Her revolt faded away, her spirit wilting down into her tired flesh. Her husband was triumphant. He had her. His eyes snapped vindictively, while his ears joyed in the sniffles she emitted. He extracted great happiness from squelching her, and she squelched easily these days, though it had been different in the first year of their married life, before the brood of children and his incessant nagging had sapped her energy. Well, you tell him tomorrow, that's all, he said. And I just want to tell you, before I forget it, that you'd better send for Marian tomorrow to take care of the children. With Tom quit, I'll have to be out on the wagon, and you can make up your mind to it to be down below waiting on the counter. But tomorrow's wash day, she objected weakly. Get up early then and do it first. I won't start out till 10 o'clock. He crinkled the paper viciously and resumed his reading. End of chapter 3.